Today, I will continue with themes that I raised last week. We started to talk about individual life cycle stages, and I focused on the one in Ericksonian theory that comes just before leaving home, because I previously talked about the family life cycle and presented a case who was having trouble with family life cycle one, leaving home. Erickson claims, as I tried to present last time, that one needs to forge an identity in order to leave home effectively, to get ready to leave home and even be willing to leave home. But if you read his works, it's very confusing about what he meant by that word identity. I think I mentioned in passing that if you read the long corpus of his work, he was productive over many decades, and he generated books and lots of papers. The supposed meaning that's attached to the word identity seems to shift in his writings over time. Sometimes it sounds like he's talking about the self, some what we call the self. Sometimes he seems to be talking about very different things. So I arrived at my own way of understanding what he meant by identity. And one of the metaphors I used was that it was like a bridge girder, not a girder, one of the things that the bridge is hung on, a bridge cable. And the bridge cable is composed of intertwined strands that are whipped around each other, and that gives much more added strength than any one of the strands would by themselves, or even the five strands side by side. And that's what's in Erickson's identity. From my perspective, they were five strands. And I picked up the first one of those strands in my last presentation, what he called historicity, a sense of one's time and place, and how one arrived there. Uh, Erickson says there's a hunger starting in adolescence for young people to hear the story of how they happened to be born. Why am I unique? Why am I here at this time and in this place? What is the history of my family? What's the history of my parents? How did they come together? Great curiosity rises about the familiar story that led to their reproduction and birth. I then said that people who are adopted often have trouble with this because they have a cut-off sense of how they arrived where they are. They often have very little or even no information about who their birth parents were, and they have nobody to interview about how they came to be in that particular time and place. They have whatever information the adoptive parents have been willing to share with them, and leaving them with many fantasy daydreams about filling in the gaps for themselves about who that was. Maybe I was born to royalty and given up to commoners. Who knows what those daydreams are without interviewing the young people. I used the story of my daughter's struggle. Yes, I mush precious women in my life together with one label sometimes. Oh, that's a wonderful tangent. Sometimes people who are courting after having had a marriage will call their new potential partner by the name of their former spouse. And then the new partner feels very injured. You haven't separated from her. She's still on your mind. No, I guess that's just how we're wired. That's a common mistake that was made. And I'll forgive myself for calling my daughter my wife. I don't know if my wife would forgive me for calling my daughter my wife. That's a whole other story, but that's not where I'm going today. At any rate, the intervention which seemed to improve her life was my constant nagging her to go on a journey to find her birth mother and to find out much more about how she came to be in this time and in this place from not only her adoptive parents, but from the birth mother and even the birth father himself. And it did have a very, very good effect on her life. It occurred to me afterwards, I didn't finish some parts of her story. So let me say that having established a relationship with the woman's name, we'll call Bonnie, that's her first name, having an ongoing relationship with Bonnie and hearing many stories from Bonnie about who Bonnie was, what Bonnie's life struggles were, and on, and getting a lot of information from Bonnie about her birth father. She settled down a lot. She found her occupational identity. That's another strand we will talk about. As her sense of historicity was repaired and blossomed more, she picked her life's calling in her late 20s. She went back to USC to graduate school and secured a master's degree in nonprofit administration. And since she couldn't go to work for the UN in Paris, which would have been her first choice, she went back to Santa Barbara, where she had gone to college because she loved the city. And she got a job as an executive director of a nonprofit whose mission was to battle the developers and to keep Santa Barbara a pleasant beach town rather than something that was getting more and more large, enormous, congested, and difficult for most of the workers in Santa Barbara at the time my daughter took hold could not afford to live in Santa Barbara because real estate had become so pricey. Even apartment rents had become so pricey. Most of what we're now calling the essential workers had to live far away and travel an hour or two to the city from outlying locations to be able to work in Santa Barbara. So she was there to fight that trend. She did that for about a decade. And then, since part of the time she was giving testimony in front of the county board of directors or the city council about one or another ordinance and proposed development project, the legislators came to know her. And one of the county board of supervisors decided to invite her to come and be her chief of staff. Uh, so she moved out of the nonprofit world and into the policy world. And that's where she works still. She is the chief of staff of one of the county board supervisors. And I think sometimes she thinks for running for county board of supervisors herself to take on the fullness of that policy role. She also moved forward in terms of, I think I'm going to go to sharing again so I can show Erickson stages once more. Yes, I have it at the red properly this time. I didn't screw up. We are talking about identity versus role confusion, but after leaving home, the next stage is intimacy versus isolation. And my daughter has it's become, I don't know if it's normative yet, but it's become a more frequent lifestyle. Everybody, and I'll talk a lot more about this at a subsequent time. Since we're pack animals, all of us need some ways to secure human relatedness. Interacting with other human beings is necessary for our sense of well-being. Now, marriage has been the traditionally affirmed way that one goes about doing that on reaching adulthood, but she did not go down that path. She dated late. She never had anything approximating a close relationship that was going to result even in a living together or even an engagement. She preferred to see people for a while and have a lot of friends. When she came back from the Peace Corps, it was even more highlighted. She put together a network of human buddies in Santa Barbara, and they meet a lot as a collective. They go out together, they go to the theater together, they travel together. She is most comfortable when she's in a group, and she does not have a close one-on-one relationship. And I'm not sure she ever will, although she does have a man in her life who comes in and out. She even lives with him part of the time, and then they separate again. They've never come close to marrying each other, but she is now beginning to post on various kinds of social media sites that she's attached to, that she's struggling with the issue of maybe now that she's in her early 50s, maybe she should get married. So she's toying with it as she gets older, but she's nowhere near close to doing that. And that's something I'll be talking about much more when I talk about intimacy versus isolation. But let me go back to identity versus role confusion. And I think I can go out of screen sharing. I hope it's going to stay where it is. So if I want to go back, it will. Yes, okay, I'm out of screen sharing, so I can be fully with you, my listeners. The second strand of Ericksonian theory that I have identified that comes in and out of his writings is what I call optimism altruism. In a healthy adolescence, kids look forward to their emancipation, they have energy to work their way towards it, and they have an optimistic view of what's going to happen after that. If you have children who are teenagers and they don't think that your generation has sold out and is corrupt and that the world is much more fixable than you idiots have ever turned your attention to, and if they're not chomping at the bit to take over and show you how it's done properly, then your adolescents are having a difficult and somewhat deformed adolescence. uh, Anna Freud, who Erickson borrowed this from, believes that if the preceding stages were worked with in a reasonable fashion, that will be the overtone of the childhood's adolescence. Yeah, there'll be miserable times, and there'll be times when they get depressed, and there'll be times when they falter. But the overarching configuration of their life is bent towards altruism and optimism and not towards despair and misery. That's a sign as they go through adolescence. Something has gone wrong at earlier stages. If that's the outstanding orientation with which they're addressing their adolescent challenges. And I need to fill in another gap. I can put normative time frames on each of these stages. Stage five, identity versus role diffusion, begins to descend, the challenges of it descend in earnest on the young person as the young person enters puberty. I can't attach an age to that because that's variable from individual to individual. And we're going through a strange transition in most of the advanced cultures of the world. Used to be common for young people to become fully pubescent somewhere between 12 and 14. The normative age is now 10.8 years. It's been moving steadily downward, decade after decade. And there are a variety of theories about why that's happening. Probably the most commonly held theory is we are putting estrogen like compounds into the world's food supply and into the world's drinking supplies. Most fertilizers break down and leave traces of compounds that are very similar in chemical structure to estrogen. And therefore, both males and females are consuming estrogen like compounds more than their bodies would have if we hadn't done this to the environment. And for girls, that speeds up the onset of puberty, and in males, it retards it. So there's a growing gap. It's always been that the girls seem to hit developmental milestones earlier than males did. Now the gap is even larger. Males, if you look through schools of graduating elementary school classes, the girls look like young women and the boys look like geeks and boys. So I don't think there's anything we can do about that except observe it and work with it as best we can as psychologists. Uh, the ending of this struggle, this era, is signaled by the ability to leave home and to take up the responsibilities that are necessary to do that, both in Ericksonian theory and in family life cycle theory, to fulfill the destiny that has to be engaged with and wrestled with as young adults. Now, many people never leave home, as we see. They never finish building. And one of the reasons is they never finish building their identities. So this is a good one. I will move on to the third strand. There's nothing in the literature that gives this a name. So I've given it a name. It is a phenomenon that's observed that at the beginning and moving on well into middle adolescence, life seems to be a public opinion struggle for adolescents. They're very preoccupied with how they are being received by others. Cliques are forming, and some people are being excluded. Bullying goes on, and they're being accused of things, or they want to be in the elite. So they want to live properly. They're very hungry to learn what proper living consists of. If a girl's going to the prom, she has to ask 12 of her dearest acquaintances what color should she wear, what style looks becoming on her. She cannot simply go to a store and make a decision on her own. She has to interview people. So that goes on a lot. And slowly there's a detachment from seeking the wisdom of the parents, and instead, who's being polled are the peer group. And almost any significant decision has to be run by the peer group, and suggestions have to be made about this fork in the road or that fork in the road. In addition, the young people are struggling with what are called the object relationship theorists in the psychoanalytic movement. That group of psychoanalysts is fascinated with another phenomenon that takes place across the lifespan, but it becomes particularly troublesome in adolescence. The object relations theorists, and I hate their language, object relations. What they're treating people as objects. That's what they're doing. The word objects refer to human relations. Uh, the theory they present to us is that we get permanently imprinted and bent this way or now that way by significant, very strong interactions we have with other people. The interactions can be very benevolent ones and very wonderful ones. So we take in sustaining things inside of ourselves. We internalize that flow that went on with those people who are sustaining. And if we've been traumatized, hurt, or disappointed, we take those in too. And we actually hear and recreate the voices of those people talking to us inside. If we're in an ambiguous landscape or if we have an important decision to make, I came to call it the critics committee because most of my internal voices are very critical and very harsh. The critics committee shows up. Oh, you idiot, you always get yourself into messes like that. You can never do anything right. What? You want to do that? That's a crazy thing to do. You're going to get in trouble if you do that. I've come to believe that the voices may be not so much tormentors as over anxious parents. They're trying to keep me from making any mistakes, making any messes, getting into any trouble. They err on the side of total cautiousness all the time. Or they're malevolent. They're really malevolent and they're on my ass because I've allowed them to come into my consciousness. I do have sustaining voices. I do have voices that say, look, you've gotten through worse messes than this. It'll be okay. Don't freak, calm down. Something else will arise. Something will replace this. You'll find a solution to the problem. They're encouraging voices, but they are the result of significant life experiences we've taken inside. So the struggle over adolescence is to hear in all that clamor and to identify what is the authentic voice of the self. So I call this strand growing one's voice. That is what is necessary to come into the fullness of a reasonable and sustaining identity formation. And there are the insecure among us, the tentative among us, that still for the rest of their life are terrified. What will the neighbors think? How am I going to be judged? I can't step outside of my family and do something different because my family's going to criticize me. And they sell out to the voices of other people, or at least they even want to monitor the voices of other people. They can't freely just go ahead if they think the public opinion poll is going to not go well or in their favor. Sometimes they can't stand anybody being upset with them. Sometimes at least the majority of people have to approve before they can proceed. But they never let go with that preoccupation. And in contrast to the other four strands, I've told you about two. This is three. There are two more to come. The other four strands come to reasonable closure before leaving home. This one often stays open normatively well into the late 20s and on into the 30s, the early 30s at least. So I don't get too worried if that's still going on for somebody who may have left home, if they're still insecure and shaky in this way about their leaving home and still needing reassurance that what they're struggling and what they're thinking about, what they're proposing to do is okay with other people. That's all right for a while into their late teens, early 20s, how long the rest of their early adulthood has to run its course. Good, we're moving along well now. Here is the fourth strand. The fourth strand is sexual identity. What is my sex and how do I respond to and take care of sexual yearnings in myself? There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of it goes on during teenage years. Uh, Most people, as I've interviewed them, who've come to my office, have known what their destination was going to be fairly early in life, somewhere around 4 or 5 years of age. People who seem to be headed for settling into a fairly well defined gay identity have known that. People who have been headed for and may settle into what is their own announced bisexual identity know that, and lesbians, people who will live as lesbians and be firmly committed. That is my identity. That's the box I'm going to check. Know that fairly early, the vast majority. Uh, it's played out in role playing games and it's played out in daydreams they're having. If they are a member of most of our culture, if their path is not towards being heterosexual, they start having trouble. They can feel that they're different, that something's wrong with them, and a battle to struggle with it, to affirm it, to conceal it, to do God knows what with it starts. It's very heartbreaking to listen to those stories about hiding and trying to conceal one's yearn for longings. They get some relief. Uh, the preliminary precursors of becoming more fully sexual are already appearing in stage 3 of the life cycle, a stage that starts at about 3.5 and extends to about 6. There's much more active stroking of the genitals and feeling comforted by the ability to stroke genitals that is going on during that era, in spite of parents' attempts to interfere with it stupidly too often. And it begins to be accompanied by some signs of having some kind of partner in the activity. And indeed, during this era, people often, little kids often go out behind the garage and they take off clothes and they want to see each other's private parts and they're trying to understand what's the differences between why is their body shaped differently and have different genitalia and other people's bodies. It's a time of some experimentation and great curiosity. According to analytic theory, that then begins to go dormant with the first stage of leaving home out into the school system and all the interesting things and demands. Sexual turmoil starts to become quiescent. It's called the latency period in psychoanalytic literature. It goes underground again and becomes quiescent for a period of time until the onset of pubescent strivings that I talked about. That unleashes it again, and now it's moving towards the fullness of its development all across the rest of adolescence. And it goes by stages. I know more about, by the way, most people don't talk about this. So it's even clients don't talk about it. There are many secrets the clients keep from us. It's not a topic that seems to come up. And unless we inquire about it, it's not going to come up. They don't define it as problematic in any way. It's what are the earliest erotic, really kind of fully erotic entrance into consciousness. And for I know a lot about males, it consists of having wet dreams. And most of us have never been prepared. Our parents don't tell us You're going to be asleep one night, you're going to have a dream, and some partner is going to come, and you're going to do some things with your penis to that partner, and it's going to get very exciting, and you're going to lose control of the excitement inside yourself. And when you wake up in the morning, something will have come out of your penis, and you will have stickiness in your pajamas. Uh, a good parent would do that because it's frightening when it happens and nobody's ever told you. You feel weird. What's going on? Oh, my God, is this an illness of some kind? What kind of strangeness is this? But for the first time, there's the fullness of arousal and discharge, and there's the presence of some kind of a partner, even if it's only in daydreams. And on we move. Soon thereafter, we start touching ourselves and we learn that, that really feels good. And we learn we can touch ourselves. And if we manipulate our genitalia, we have to discover how to do that. We can make that happen ourselves without anybody else. And when we're not asleep, it's not a dream anymore. It's something that's happening in the real world. I don't know any culture where this doesn't go on accompanied by terrible shame. It seems to be almost universal that we teach people that you don't do that, and there's something wrong with you. Oh, I can remember I was in the Boy Scouts. I was in the Cub Scouts and then went on into the Boy Scouts for a year, and it felt like a totalitarian crazy place to me. I rebelled against it even then. I decided I didn't want to go on and be an Eagle Scout. But one thing I remember was that this topic was talked about in the Boy Scouts manual. If you feel yourself having strange feelings in your genitals, what you need to do is go take a cold shower. That's that's what the advice was in the Boy Scout manual. Oh my. Uh, at the same time, though, while we're furtively and in secret struggling with the attempt to arouse and pleasure ourselves, and I think from what I've heard from female clients who have talked about this, they get stigmatized and squelched even worse than males do. There are actually, I've had lots of female clients. I think I've only had one or two male clients who never in their life have masturbated. It's gotten totally killed in them. They're not aware of any desire to masturbate. The idea seems disgusting to them. And even getting them to think about touching themselves feels yucky to them. That's not in the mainstream, most people, thank God. We will do it furtively and with guilt and shame and worries that we're going to be found out. And what's even more shocking is what young males do to each other. They use masturbation as a curse and an insult. If you're in a boys' locker room for a PE class and they look at you, they start teasing you. I bet you jack off when you're at home. How disgusting. You're a jack off artist. And why aren't they admiring it? Why are we teasing and being cruel to each other when that's what everybody else is doing too? It's really one of the insanities of culture. Now, outside of bed, activity is taking place. We're in school. We see there, unless we went to a parochial school, there are females there as well as males, and we're seeing them, and their breasts are growing, and they're coming closer to looking like the kinds of daydreams we have inside of ourselves about what our destiny is. If we're gay, the other person we're looking at young males sitting in the classroom. But at any rate, we find ourselves, to our horror, having crushes. We yearn to embrace them, to be with them, to spend time with them, to explore things with them. But we're terrified. We're terrified of surrendering to that impulse. After a while, we may get the courage to tell our chimes, "Oh, what do you think of so and so? Uh, I really want to be with him. I can't stop thinking about him." Now, if you're really repressed, most of your crushes in the beginning are with people who are totally unavailable. there's no chance you could even get together with somebody because they're unavailable. Maybe your school teacher you're beginning to have erotic thoughts about. You're certainly not going to. Oh, and there are crazy school teachers who have sex with their with their teenage students too, but that's fairly rare. The likelihood of that leading to anything is not very great. Or it's a movie star, or it's a singer, or it's somebody you see on a TV program. You just are hungering for them. You can't get enough of watching them and looking at them or listening to them, but it's quite safe because nothing's ever going to happen. Now, the problem is gradually our yearnings and our crushes start shifting towards people who are real. That is a more healthy development. We begin to get interest in peers or people who are close to our peers. And now we don't exactly avoid them. We sort of move around them and circle around them, or we'll go up to them when we're in a pack and we don't have to be alone with them. And we start interacting. And often the first way we interact is the exchange of bitchy sarcasm and teasing. That's the way we interact with each other because that helps keep us safe. Uh, a young man will go up to a girl, and if he will pull her hair and say, "You're such a dork," and then he will run away. He's probably lusting after her, but he doesn't have the courage to say anything like that to her. He's going to pull her hair and call her a name and then rush away. Slowly, slowly moving towards middle adolescence, that 15, 14, 15, 16, it depends on how one is raised and one's courageousness. Conversations actually start. Did you see that movie last week? This is towards a possible somebody that one is attracted to. Real conversations start, usually about trivial things. And but it grows. It grows and intensifies and becomes more real and more intimate. People move from wanting willingness. Oh, hanging out is a good group example of that. We hang out with people we yearn for, but we do it in groups, so nothing can happen. After a while, we start seeing people one on one. And after a while, we start becoming more real. And after a while, we start having conversations about who we are. And after a while, we start actually touching the other person or beginning to get physical with the other person. Uh, I guess kids don't do this much anymore. When I was 12, we started to go to co-ed parties. That was allowed and okay. And sometimes parents would leave us alone. And one of our favorite pastimes was to play spin the bottle. A girl would go into the closet and wait there for us. We would spin the bottle, and whoever the bottle pointed to, whatever guy the boy pointed to, the girl had to come out of closet, and we had to kiss. We had to experiment with kissing. And that was a socially sanctioned game somehow, in the peer group at least. I don't know what our parents thought about it. Uh, Kids don't do that anymore. And well, Scott, maybe you'll say some comments about what are the mechanisms. You work a lot more with the early adolescent population than I do. What are the mechanisms by which people are able to grope towards coupling up with each other that didn't exist before? Uh, on we go. By later teenage life, uh, people are beginning to neck, what we used to call neck, to pet, to do foreplay, to experiment. Oh, girls now, the culture has changed. Girls begin to get willing to experiment with oral sex on a guy because that's what guys really like. They feel powerful when they do that because they take control of the guy's excitement and they're left alone largely. And that's not really having sex. That's just experimenting and playing around. That's almost like Bill Clinton. I did not have sex with that woman. There's still versions because they haven't had sex with the guy. And unless you have phallic penetration of the vagina, if you're heterosexual, then no real sex has taken place. It's only experimentation. Usually the statistics are pretty powerful. There have been surveys taken of kids, very anonymous surveys where they could feel safe. And by the graduation from high school, 82% of males and 68% of females have had an act of intercourse by that time. I promise you, we're not very adept at it, and we don't do very well at it, but we at least have done that. Now, no enduring intimacy typically arises from that. Uh, what happens is the most typical thing for males to do is to play hit and run. We will not solemnify anything that's going on. We want to accumulate a body count if we can. Supposedly, the more we can have recreational sex with young women, the more of a jock we are, the more esteemed we are by our colleagues. And the male culture, the dominant male culture in the US society, esteems not being what's called pussy whipped. We're not really going to surrender and get very attached to any woman and give any female much power over us. So on we go, and we have done that much experimentation and learned that much about how one carries out the mechanics of having a sex act with a peer. Gay people do the same kind of experimentation. They do it differently than straight people do. But we are not ready for any enduring commitments to anybody, except for if we're on a deviant path and we're making a premature commitment to settling in too early, from my perspective. I did that. By the time I was 16, I was, quote, going steady with a young woman who later became my wife. I was 21 when I married her, and she was 20. We broke apart several times, thank God, but I didn't listen to the real experiences I was having. And I was too scared to go to graduate school without taking someone with me to a strange place. So I married her, foolishly enough. And the culture pressured us to do that. Half of the people I was going to college with were already married by the time that they were 21. A few even had children by then. I'm glad that that doesn't go on now. Our culture has become enormously more complex, and people do need more time to experiment with all kinds of things before they make life-defining choices. So that's a good one. I'm glad that one's changing. Uh, yeah, the final tuning of one's sexuality happens in the context of a caring relationship where we learn much more about the depths that can happen when people become intimate not only with their bodies but intimate with their souls as well. And that's a topic I'll talk about when I talk about the next stage, intimacy versus isolation. So let me go on to the fifth strand. The fifth strand of identity is occupational identity. We not only need to develop some beginning thoughts about who our likely intimate partners are going to be to help us to leave home, but we have to have at least some beginning ideas about what are we going to do in this world when we're no longer in school and learning and being the child of our parents. What place are we going to take up in the world and start using ourselves to do certain things that we need to do to earn a living or have some impact on where the world is going? What is what I call our occupational identity? Now, often there's beginning playful play with that, even for kids who are just in preschool. I want to be a fireman, or I want to go to space. The beginning strands of trying on various occupational identities occur. I'm going to be Superman. Who knows what they are? But there are potential role models and potential buds of occupational identities dangling there. Uh, I worry, however, if I work with a child who's in fourth grade and he comes in with all seriousness and he tells me, I'm going to be a neurosurgeon when I grow up. And he says it with a great certainty and a great fixed attitude about that. I worry somebody or some people or some collective has been pressuring him to come to premature closure of his occupational identity. I'll tell you what I think is an interesting and worthwhile occupational identity. that there's the trying on of many possibilities during elementary school and middle school. There's the trying on of a more limited number of those by the time one gets into high school. I think I had two when I graduated high school. I was either going to be a novelist or I was going to be a nuclear physicist. Those were my two possible identities, but I was still quite open about which path I was going to take. Sometimes, for those who go to college, sometimes during college, there should be a greater closure. I don't know if this is going to work for me, but I think of all things, if I had to make a choice now, and I guess I need to try it out, I'm going to do X. That feels to me like a healthy time frame and a healthy coming to the beginnings of some closure, not a fixed rigidity yet. The 20s can be a time of experimentation, of making false starts. I think I want to get in the entertainment industry. My dad is in the entertainment industry. I get a job as a PA. He'll get me a job. I think my destination is in the entertainment industry. It's fine if they do that for a few years, move up a little and say, this is a corrupt place. I don't want to be in this industry. This industry is crazy. I think I want to become an investment banker. I better go get an MBA. I don't think that's a good destination either, but that's okay. The person's going to try something different in their 20s. They're in their early to middle 20s now still. They go back to school. Wonderful, fine. The coming to closure of one's occupational identity can wait until well into the 30s, actually. I don't get worried about anybody. That's fine. If they're not staying at home and doing nothing, and if they're actively engaged in trying out what the possibilities are and whether they fit or not. I often tell clients who are struggling with that, you know what? You have a choice. I know you're miserable and confused right now. You can pay your dues now. You can be miserable, confused, and life can be without meaning because you haven't solved the riddle yet for some time to come. But I'm telling you, your years of preparation are going to come to a close sometimes between 35 and 40. People like you who are in misery during their 20s and late 20s and even early 30s are paying their dues up front. When you finally make your choice, I think you're less likely to have what we call colloquially in our culture a midlife crisis than if you fix yourself too early now and jump into something. It gets harder and harder to pull yourself out. If you then made a marriage and have children, you're partly responsible for it too. You're in structures that are harder to extricate yourself from if you make a mistake and need to do something else. If you wait that long and have enough false starts and enough trying of things, you're more likely to pick something that's likely to endure for decades ahead. You may outgrow that too if you live too long, but you're not likely to have what we classically call a midlife crisis in your 30s or 40s when it becomes really hard to change and find the freedom to be flexible. So that is my thing that I wanted to talk about. I've now laid out the five strands of identity, at least two of them occupational identity and uh, uh, sexual identity is not quite finished, occupational identity is not quite finished. And finding one's voice is actually waiting until the other two get completed. That's the last one that falls into place, where one loses a lot of the preoccupation with public opinion and hears a sturdy voice inside that's instructing about a variety of choices and comforting in a variety of crises. One's been those who can keep flexible during the period ahead have greater optimism about if they're in a mess again, they will find their way through it. So I will close that stage and I will start something. I'm amazed I got here this quickly. Maybe I skipped over too much too quickly. Maybe I left too many confusions in my listeners. But I promised I was going to read a story. And it was a story about somebody who was in trouble because of difficulties with forming an identity. And I decided not to read the story because I want to identify the two strands of the identity that are embedded in why this person was in trouble with identity problems. Occupational identity had been brought to a premature closure when this person was 4 years old, and sexual identity was still in a mess. He had a public sexuality and a big private sexuality, and he pretended to be somebody he wasn't in his sexual carryings on. So let me read this story. It's one of my favorites. The title is that I gave it, Striving for Redemptive Meaning. A real life Elziard Bouffier. There is a French folktale about the man whose name is at the top of this story. Elziard Bouffier probably never existed, but in the account that has been written of him and is part of French mythology, he is reputed to have been hiking in Provence and found himself at the end of a certain day of his journey, parched, tired, and alone on a very desolate plain, one almost devoid of vegetation. For some reason, the barren surroundings spoke to his soul, and he decided that he was going to transform it, make it verdant, and make it a place welcoming to insects, birds, animals, and yes, humans. For several years thereafter, Bouffier devoted himself to making walking trips into and out of that place of desolation. On each journey, he brought back with him the seeds of a variety of trees or little saplings of trees themselves. He would plant all that he was carrying tenderly, and he would reverently minister to his fast growing crop with each trip back. After many, many years, the area had indeed become lush, full of bumblebees and butterflies, vegetation of all kinds, birds of all varieties, flowering shrubs, squirrels, chipmunks, deer, and yes, humans who would walk through the park-like environs and wonder and have reverence at the quote natural unquote beauty of it all. So, does any of this have to do with my career as a psychologist? Bear with me, and after a time, it will become clear why my work with the client I'm about to describe has brought back to me the story of the mythic Elziard Bouffier. I shall begin thus. For those of us who make careers out of counseling persons who struggle to learn to live with their lives with less distress and more fulfillment, one of the biggest challenges we face is how can we go about working with a client who shows up and we soon discover that we don't like the client at all. Sometimes we find ourselves called upon to sit through a first meeting and listen to a story of a life lived in a fashion that seems reprehensible to us. What are we to do? The empirical research in our field suggests that the variable that best predicts a good outcome for our efforts is whether or not we can create a relationship of mutual trust, respect, caring, and regard with the person seeking our aid. The task can be more daunting if we find the other with whom we are being asked to engage is a person living a life that we find odious. We are supposed to be, quote, objective, close quotes, but that is a nonsensical and impossible aim. We psychologists are human. We make judgments. We have preconceptions. We have prejudices. We are committed to certain values. We cannot escape that. At best, we can try to give an accepting space to those who seek our services and sometimes hold in abeyance our personal and strongly held beliefs if what we are hearing jars our sensibilities. Mark put me to such a test and deeply challenged my capacity to care about him. I saw him for the first time in the early 1990s. He was referred to me by someone who had been a fellow student in several of my classes at Los Angeles High School more than 40 years earlier. As teenager, my classmate Hank Rich, I will call, and I were close chums. We were members of different friendship networks, We knew each other, we had some classes in common, and I believe we respected each other's intelligence. Hank was headed off to a career as an orthopedic surgeon, and I was beginning to aspire to a career either as a nuclear physicist or as a novelist. So much for adolescent images of life's destinies. The two of us had not kept touch with each other at all after graduating high school. Through a distant network of human interconnections, I did know, however, that Hank had fulfilled his career longings and had indeed developed a reputation as being one of the best orthopedic surgeons in our city. I had no idea that he had tracked me and my career in any way, so I was surprised to have received a referral from him. And then in came Mark. Mark entered my office with an obvious chip on his shoulder. Quote, I don't believe you can do a damn bit of good. I don't know what I'm doing here, close quotes. Quote, you might be right, but how am I to understand what you're saying to me? I don't know a thing about you yet. So far, you told me Dr. Rich has referred you. Dr. Rich hasn't contacted me. I haven't had the remotest chance to come to some verdict about whether or not it makes sense for you to be here. So why don't you begin by telling me it is that you've already come to the conclusion before we've even had any conversation with each other that you're in the wrong place and I can't do anything for you? Quote, I went to see Dr. Rich because he was supposed to be my specialist of last resort. I have terrible low back pain. It cripples my life. I've been to more orthopods than I can count. I've had endless MRI. I've had steroid shots. I've had surgeries. No one's been able to give me any real help at all. Finally, several docs I trust told me that I should go see Dr. Rich. If anyone could find out what's wrong with me and fix it, they said, it would be him. So I spent a lot of time with Dr. Rich. He did some more x-rays and his own MRI studies. He did nerve conductance tests. He did some blood tests on me that no one else had done so far. Last week, I sat down with him to discuss his findings. He told me that there was absolutely no medical reason for me to be in such pain. He showed me on the x-rays that there was some early arthritic process in a few of my lumbar spinal vertebrae, about normal for someone in his mid 40s, he said, but nothing that could cause the pain that comes on me so often. He said that he thought the whole thing was, quote, psychological, unquote. So he was sending me to you. He said that he thought, the doc I was told to be the smartest one I could see winds up telling me the pain's all in my head. Damn him, my pain's real. It's not in my head, it's in my back. I know I'm not imagining it. Why can't I find a doctor who knows what to do with me? I apologized to Mark. I'm sorry Dr. Rich's evaluation seems so disappointing and maybe even cruel and dismissive to you. You must have had high hopes when you went to see him. Unfortunately, there's little in the training of orthopedic surgeons that's focused on how they should learn to talk sensibly and kindly to those seeking care. As a matter of fact, when I was in graduate school many years ago, I had to have surgery on my pelvis. The orthopedic surgeon who operated on me was, and I won't miss words, a wonderful craftsman, but a real son of a bitch. I had to be in the hospital many weeks, and he often spent his days well into the evening or into the wee hours of the early morning doing trauma surgery with victims of automobile or skiing accidents. When his shift was over, it was his habit to go through the hospital, stopping by the beds of those on whom he had recently operated before he went home for the night. He'd come by and see me still in his bloodied hospital garb. If I was asleep, he'd wake me up gruffly with, wake up, I want to know how you are. Once he stopped by, I'd been feeling particularly lousy, frustrated at still being in the hospital. I was trapped, totally encased in a body cast, and as helpless as a turtle turned over on its back. I was sick of my long recovery. I wanted to go back to my life, my studies, my wife. I asked him, how much longer am I going to have to be here? His irritated response was, "Shut up, stop asking. You'll be here exactly as long as I think you need to be here. Where you don't need, you'll leave when you don't need to be here anymore. I'll tell you, be quiet and go back to sleep." I then went on in my attempt to say something to Mark that might be more understandable and more acceptable than the words that have been uttered by Dr. Rich. So maybe I can translate Dr. Rich's remarks in a way that won't seem so unfeeling and might make better sense to you. Here goes. For many of us, and I envy all who are so endowed, there's a certain body organ system that begins to ask for attention when our lives are not being lived well. If we become frustrated, despairing, stuck, helpless, or lost in a variety of other unpleasant feeling states because something in our lives has gone off in a bad direction, it can be our body that starts flashing alarms, starts asking for our attention so that we can make some transformations, not in our body, but in how we live. We get headaches, or we get backaches, or our colon acts up, or God knows what else. In this fashion, through the pain and distress our bodies are emitting, and the pain is certainly real, we're tapping ourselves on our own shoulder, asking ourselves to look around and take stock and to begin to alter our lives. I think the message is one Dr. Rich, in his own way, was trying to give you about why your back hurts. He thinks your cure can't be found by some new manipulation of your body, a drug, microsurgery, or who knows what else. What would cure you might be your ability to discover what's wrong with the way you're living and then making some other life choices. I hope that's clear. To put it another way, you may have to change some of your beliefs, some of your activities, some of your values, some of your priorities, some of your relationships for how you spend time in order for the pain to subside. Give me some help in trying to figure all of this out. Please let me ask you this. Is your life the life you want to be living? Do you feel pleased with what you do each day after you get up in the morning? I want to do an assessment how you think about and conduct that life. And with your help to see if something about it really might need to be changed in order to sustain you much better. To tell you the truth, Doc, I'm really unhappy because 2 years ago, I lost the only job I ever loved, and I can't seem to find any replacement for it. Oh my God, I'm sorry to hear that, I said, slipping into my own personal reverie. I was worrying about how likely it was that Mark was in some real financial strain. If he were, I would then it would then result my need to charge him only some very minimal fee if he were going to be able to pay me so we could work together. Oh, was I in for a surprise? Mark, are you frightened about finances? You've been out of work for 2 years. Uh, Is this a problem partly about being able to keep things together? Do you have a family to support? Are you getting into distress about going into debt and not being able to manage to pay your bills? Hearing the beginning of his narrative, I certainly found myself vicariously worried about those matters for myself, as well as how he'd not be able to pay to see me very much. My query turned out to be wildly off the mark. No, I came away from my job loss with plenty of money in the bank. I don't have to be concerned about the financial part of our lives. And yes, I'm married and have two little boys in elementary school. So, what was your career and how did you lose your position? That question opened the floodgate. I was a junk bond trader. I got caught up in the government's criminal investigation of the junk bond market a couple of years back. In the end, I entered a plea bargain. I turned state's evidence against some of the major players in the arena. So I wasn't persecuted. I didn't have to do any jail time, and the feds didn't come after my personal funds. So I'm okay financially, but I've been disbarred by the SEC And except for managing my own asset portfolio, I can't do any security trading any again for the rest of my life. Creating, marketing junk bonds has been the only career I've never ever known and has had any meaning for me. I was really good at it. It's killing me to be doing nothing except watching over my own personal investments. I want to get back into the game. I have a lot of capital to park somewhere. I got business brokers all over the country bringing businesses for sale for me to look at. I'd like to find a promising one that I could take over. I'm good at management. I have an MBA in management and an MBA in economics. I'd like to grow that business and take it public so I could make a killing again. There's nothing in my agreement with the feds that would prevent me from owning a business and building it and taking it public. But I can't find anything that looks decent. I've looked at business after business, and none of them, if you crunch the numbers, look like a winner. Over the next 30 minutes, I reviewed Mark's current lifestyle and practices. He was living a life of extreme opulence. The family occupied a seven bedroom, seven bathroom home on extensive grounds in the hills above Beverly Hills, California. The dwelling contained a media room and a wine cellar with a lavish collection of fine wines. The humans in the household included not only his wife and two young sons, but a full-time gardener, a full-time maid, a part-time personal assistant, and two nannies. He owned five automobiles so that he could indulge whatever automotive yearnings he had on any particular day. His boys were enrolled in an expensive private school. His wife had permission to shop for anything whenever and wherever she might want. Mark belonged to the most prestigious country club in the area. The family went to the most expensive restaurants frequently. And in addition to their life in Southern California, the family took many first class junkets during the school holidays and traveled a few times a year to a restored farmhouse Mark had purchased in the south of France. My clients' days were typically taken up with watching financial programs on television, reading the newsletters of financial pundits, reviewing his stock portfolio, doing some day trading, and looking at the documentation provided to him for businesses that he might think about acquiring. At least three times a week, he would go to the country club to play golf with old friends, but frequently would have to leave before he finished the 18 holes because his back would start hurting him so badly. Listening to Mark's review of his present circumstances consumed almost all of our first meeting, and before time evaporated, I wanted to make sure if he would change his mind and seem some way to have further conversations with me. So I said to Mark, your story is quite tragic. You are wealthier than about 99.99% of the Earth's population. You have the means to indulge almost any whim you can generate, but you're restless, you're frustrated that your career has come to an abrupt end, you search for something else to ease your unease and confusion and give purpose to your life, and your back, you search for something like that, and your back is sending you what I think may be alarm signals warning you that you're in trouble. Let me ask you something I don't know if you've ever thought about very much. Mark, what is the purpose of your life? Mark doesn't hesitate. It's to grow my net worth, of course. How much do you have to grow it yet? Do you need $50 million in acquired capital? 100 million? Do you ever get to stop? Do you need to become a billionaire? Some fortunate enough in your circumstances already would embrace some kind of quote retirement unquote and gladly turn their attention to other matters. As long as I'm alive and as long as I have my senses, there's nothing else that will be as important to me than adding to my holdings. So I replied, Now I know why your back hurts and why to help you. I am going to tell you something. You're lying to yourself. The purpose of your life is not to add to your holdings. You're like a juggernaut that's gone out of control. Mark bristled at what he was experiencing. As what he experienced, I believe, as a stern rebuke I was inflicting on him. Well, if you're so damn cocksure and smart, what the hell is the purpose of my life? My reply surprised him. He was looking for a debating contest, but I had nothing for him that would create a debate. Mark, I don't know what the purpose of your life is. It's already embedded in you somewhere, but you're not looking at it yet. I wouldn't presume even to propose some answer to that question for you. I'm not you. The search for meaning and purpose is absolutely personal. The best I can do, if we're both lucky, is to help keep you company and maybe guide you occasionally as you go on a real search to find it. But we're almost out of time today. How about coming back for a while and giving me a chance to continue this conversation a bit longer to see if I might be of any help to you? What are you going to charge me? My fee is $350 per 50-minute session for you. My God, do you charge that everyone that much? No, I don't. I see some clients for nothing. Two pay me $5 a meeting, and all the rest pay much less than I'm going to charge you. Since I began my career, I've always found a fee that's aligned with what a clients can manage without them having to hurt terribly. For you, $350 a visit is chump change. It's even much less than you had to pay your lawyers per hour when you were facing criminal charges. I still don't see why I should pay you that fee when you're willing to see most of your clientele for much less. You don't have to work with me, but if you come here, I am going to force you to do philanthropy. I myself live in a lifestyle that's a tad better than just modest, and I feel grateful for that. But like everyone, I do have bills to pay for all that's necessary for life. And talking to clients is how I generate income to do that and how I keep accumulating some money for the day when I might be able to work anymore. Unfortunately for you, I want to be open to seeing all persons who want to see me, regardless of their ability to pay a certain fee. So I'm going to require that you be Robin, that you reward me very well and let me be Robin Hood. Reward me for the time I'll be spending with you. You are going to help me find ways to care for the much less fortunate than you, or I'll be able to give my time away to them too. If you don't want to do that, I have lots of colleagues in Beverly Hills or Brentwood who have fixed rates in the range of $200 to $250 a visit. I'd be happy to give you a few other names if you would prefer not to come back. And I will stop with that cliffhanger for today. And I will go on with the story of Mark next time. All right. You can unmute yourself, and all comments are welcome. And I do have another thing I forgot to say before I started my story, because it attaches much more powerfully later on to one of the developmental stages of life, one of the Ericksonian stages. Uh, One of our colleagues, God, I'm having a senior moment. I'll remember it before next week. A German uh, former psychoanalyst who broke away. Oh, Alfred Adler. It's back. Alfred Adler became a rebel against Freud and developed his own sense of what psychoanalysis was all about. But he focused on something that's very powerful. He agrees with me, or I came to agree with him, that we humans are endowed with two competing yearnings: the yearning to fulfill our own lives and to take care of our egocentrism and our whims and what feels pleasurable and good for us, and empathy and altruism. Uh, you see, in adolescence, I talked about this needing to develop in kids as they get ready to leave. We're also programmed to care about others. And This man I was hearing about had cancer of the egocentrism and a total atrophy of any empathy. He clearly had male scripting that he was to provide richly for himself and a few people in his cohort, his wife, his children, and as you'll hear, his parents. The whole human race beyond that, he did not give a fig about, not one fig. He was totally lacking in any empathy for the human condition and any altruism to do anything for anybody beyond his immediate family. So that was sending a warning flag to me that some of the work I had to do in the future was to open him up to that. That was actually the age he was at. That was the challenge of the age he was at, and his fucked up identity was preventing him from moving through that age in any intelligent or sensible fashion. Okay, now I will rest. I'm happy. I'm beginning to give the listeners more sense out of how useful developmental perspectives can be for helping to shape the conversations we have with clients. There's nothing about a DSM-2 diagnosis of borderline personality disorder that helps us shape a conversation with anybody. Okay, I'm open for comments or questions.
Arthur, I was particularly intrigued with the concept of forging an identity.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you might comment a little bit more or kind of provide some context to the concept of why am I unique? How am I unique?
I don't think I understand you yet. Can you say some more words so I can tune in? Are you saying what is the process of forging that identity? Or
Yes, in terms of how can one determine how one becomes or is unique?
oh, well, that there is a process, and for each of those strands of identity, there's work that has to be done. The with regard to historicity, the child has to get curious and get information from other sources and other people about what his unique place in the world is. So he begins to get a sense of uniqueness as he struggles with his altruism and optimism. He has to begin to take looks at everything around him. What's going on in the world? How can I look at what's happening everywhere? What is my place in all the things that are unfolding in other places in the world? How can I do some goodness for the collective? How can I help the people I'm attached to? How can I have empathy for them? I have a role to play in bettering the lives of others, and the images of how that role is to begin to be played start to come together. One of the other strands that's influenced by that, this is occupational identity. What place am I going to take up? So lots of experiences with false identities, lots of trying on identities and throwing them away need to be gotten. And finally, there's those stages in the unfolding of one's sexual behavior. How do I relate sexually? What is my unique way to relating sexually to another sexual human being? And later on, I'm going to have to conform some of my quirkiness, some of what's unique about my sexuality with the quirkiness and strangeness of differences in my partner's sexuality. Thank you for asking that question. You made me really be more specific about many important things. Anything else?
Yeah, I was thinking about I've run across clients too that seem to lack or not have a very strong sense of altruism,
Yeah.
and it always calls back to I remember I think it was the evolutionary psychologist would talk about the paradox of altruism, that essentially there isn't much that it was difficult to find the pressure in evolution for people to be altruistic, right? To seek the benefit of another. And what comes up is that there is a psychological charge, a benefit that comes from actually helping other people. And it
Yeah.
does, in this community way, kind of help people. And that's when I start doing little behavioral experiments with clients to try to
To try and let them sample a little bit of altruism.
Yeah, yeah, to try to get that, to see if they can get that charge. I think it seems, as psychologists, we probably have a perhaps even an overdeveloped sense of altruism.
Yes,
And
we do.
yeah, and I think we almost sometimes maybe take it for granted that other people see the world or feel the world that way, and getting them to experience it.
Well, I'll bring politics up. I reassure you, Donald Trump does not feel a shred of altruism.
Yeah.
And yes, there are people who in the everyday parlance are called pleasers. They cannot do anything to affirm themselves, as a matter of fact, unless everybody who might comment on it or be affected by it is okay with it. Then maybe they can give themselves. Helping people to balance themselves along these two dimensions is very important.
Mhm.
And it's made more difficult because we start off in total egocentrism. We scream in discomfort. We want to be soothed. We want to be comforted. We can't survive unless other people are taking care of us, and we competency too. So altruism slowly unfolds. Giving a kid a pet to be responsible for is a good thing to do, for example. That helps. They have somebody beyond themselves to be responsible for.
Mhm. Mhm.
Ah. Oh, is that your son I hear calling out in the background?
Yeah, there's intense video games going on during the pandemic.
Mm.
Yeah, he seems to be having a very good time. He's lost in
Mhm.
his whatever he's doing.
Yeah, it's a
Anything
very
else for today?
fortunate. Yeah, that's it for me.
All right, then I'll thank you both, and I'll be back again with you next Friday, and I'll finish my story, I believe.
Great.
Okay, all right, be well. Have a good.
Bye.